Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cristina, and I'm going to be your host for today's Nature Live Online. Now, if you've been watching, thank you so much and welcome back. And if you just came across Nature Live Online, let me tell you a little bit more about it. Now, Nature Live was a show that used to happen at the Natural History Museum in London, but when the pandemic hit back in March, we decided to keep bringing the museum, its collections, its scientists, and its stories to your homes. Now, Nature Live Online is a free event, but the museum, it is a charity and we need your help. With our doors closed, we are losing vital income. So if you're able to make a donation to the museum, no matter what the size, we will really appreciate it. Now, if you're watching from YouTube, you can donate with the donation button on the right hand side of your screen on top of the chat. And if you're watching from the Natural History Museum website, the donation button is on the top right corner on your screen. Now, also a quick reminder that we are streaming live. This means that you can ask your own questions to our guests during the show, and I'll try to get through as many questions as possible. Now, without any further ado, let me tell you a little bit about the show today. I'm really excited because we're going to be talking about a topic that doesn't get talked that much, and that topic is periods. Periods in humans and periods in nature. And for that, we have a very special guest with us. We have the fantastic Dr. Natalie Cooper with us. Hello, Natalie.
Hi.
Hello, Natalie. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, before we start talking about periods, I want to talk a little bit about yourself, about your role at the Natural History Museum and what you do there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a senior researcher in the vertebrates division. So that means I work on mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes. And I'm really interested in how all of this diversity has evolved.
And that's why I came to you when I decided I wanted to talk about this topic online. As I said before, we're going to talk about periods. We're going to talk about what animals get them, what animals don't, and why is that. But before we start talking about those animals, let's talk about what is a period, what is menstruation, what is a menstrual cycle. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Natalie?
Yep, sure. So basically, the period, or a menstrual period, more technically, is just when the lining of the uterus or the womb is shed at the end of a cycle. And so usually we see the menstrual cycle represented like this. So in humans, it's an average of about 28 days, although some people have longer or shorter menstrual cycles. And at the beginning of the cycle, you see the period. And then as things move through that 28-day period, you can see that the womb lining here in the picture slowly increases in thickness up to the end of that cycle. And this is controlled by many hormones, but in particular, the two you've probably heard of are estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen helps to start building up the thickness of the womb, and then there's like a little spike that happens there just before ovulation. So that's when one or more eggs are released from the ovaries and start traveling down the fallopian tubes to potentially be fertilized. So if they do get fertilized, we have this window of implantation, which appears later on in the cycle. And so that would be when the embryo would sort of land on that nice, thick, spongy lining. If it doesn't, then instead you get a drop in progesterone, and that's what triggers a period. So that triggers the shedding of that. And then we go back around and we start all over again with that cycle. And in animals that don't do this, just so you can see the pictures next to each other, we have the same hormones going on, slightly different effects of estrogen, but you can see that the lining of the womb is much thinner, and rather than a period occurring, it just gets reabsorbed into the animal.
Right, so we're going to keep talking about animals that have them and animals that know. But I think this is quite relieving for people, for us people that have periods, because I think that we have them, but sometimes we don't know what's going on with our body. So there is in a picture for everyone. Now humans menstruate, but what about other animals then, Natalie? I think we've already established some animals do, some animals don't. But what other animals menstruate?
So it's actually quite a weird strategy. So we're only talking about mammals. Other animals have different reproductive strategies, and we're only talking about placental mammals, so not marsupials and not the egg-laying mammals. But within placental mammals, it's not that common. So we see it in our closest relatives, which might not be that surprising. So in the apes, for example, so gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and also in monkeys that you find in Africa and Asia. So things like macaques have periods. We're not so sure about the South American, Central American species of monkey, or things like tarsiers, and lemurs definitely don't seem to have periods. So those ones are the ones we might expect because they're closely related to us. But there's also some surprise ones that pop up. So there are a couple of species of bat which have periods. So two species do this and have the kind of cycles that we have as well. And so they're the fulvous fruit bat, which is pictured here, and also the black mastiff bat. And then another species which also has the same kind of menstrual cycling that we have and a period is the common spiny mouse. And this is the most recent discovered species to menstruate. So this was discovered in 2017. And so there's some really exciting research being done on those. There are also other species which sort of menstruate, depending on how you define it. So they do shed the lining of the womb, but they don't have a menstrual cycle. So a good example that people might have heard of if they've looked into this would be elephant shrews or sengis, which I think we've got a nice picture of, and they don't bleed in a kind of cyclical way. They just bleed at the end of the breeding season. And this also happens in a couple of other species of bat. So one of them, the Pallas's long-tongued bat, for example, only bleeds once a year.
And I think it's really surprising. I think if thinking about it, you might have think, okay, so primates, some apes as well might have menstruated, but seeing animals that are quite different to us and also from different parts of the mammals tree of life is quite interesting. Now, Natalie, I want to say we're already getting questions, really good questions from our audience, and some of them are questions actually that I already had planned for you. But before I go to those, now that we've seen these animals, we know that they go through the menstrual cycles or some sort of menstrual cycle like humans do. Are the cycles then the same, or are they very different, or does it depend on the species?
So in the primates that cycle, so the apes in particular are really quite similar to us. They're slightly longer cycles and they're a bit more regular than ours. So gorillas, it's about 30 to 32 days, and chimpanzees, it's about 37 days, so a little bit longer than ours. I did recently look up the spiny mouse, and I think they've got the real terrible deal here. So their cycles range between 6 and 10 days, an average of about 8, and they have a 3-day period. So you could be having a 6-day cycle, 3-day period. Yeah, so I don't want to be a spiny mouse.
Definitely not. And something as well about the spiny mouse, we'll talk in a minute. But what do they have in common then, these animals? Do they have anything that makes them all have these periods and the different cycles, or is it just
we're still not completely sure. So there are certain similarities among the primates that all menstruate. So there's a particular kind of placenta, which we'll go on to explain about in a little bit, that they tend to have. But the other ones, there doesn't seem to be a very good, clear sort of link necessarily. So we're looking forward to seeing this research in the spiny mouse to learn a bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. And Natalie, I want to say the questions that we had a question from Anne-Sophie. They're asking about why we having this, what is the evolution, in evolutionary terms, why are we having periods? There's another question from YouTube as well. What is the evolutionary benefit of menstruation? We're going to talk that in a minute. But since seeing that picture of the elephant shrew and seeing our relatives as well out there, it just pops into my mind another question, and is, do these animals experience menstruation like we do? And the first thing I think of is premenstrual syndrome, especially looking at this elephant shrew that doesn't seem very happy. So for those of you who don't know what premenstrual syndrome is when people that experience periods have also experienced some health issues, pains, migraines, and different sensations before the period. So do we know if these animals go through that or not?
So again, this is something we need to do more research on. But one of the really great things about the spiny mouse being discovered to menstruate is that we can start doing more research, and hopefully that will help people who do suffer from PMS quite badly. And so there's already been a little bit of preliminary research using the spiny mice to try and work out whether they suffer from PMS, and it seems like they do. So they find that they're a little bit sad when they have their periods. They tend to vocalize more. They don't move around so much, and at different points in their cycle, they eat different amounts and things like that. So I think all of us that menstruate can sympathize with the poor old spider mouse. And so this is really exciting because it's a really great model system for us to study this a bit more and hopefully help people that menstruate as well.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting to know that we can actually start finding out more about it, because the general feeling that I'm getting is that we still need to know more about this. We still need to do more research. We don't know that much. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But before we move on, how much do we know about these? I've got a question that is, how have we found out about these? Have we found out about all the animals having periods?
So for a lot of animals, it will be through captivity. So people in zoos, for example, noticing what's going on with their zoo animals. Probably my favorite bit of research that was done on this, because I've no idea how they did it, was to try and work out how much blood was produced by macaques. And so they trained these macaques to use tampons, and then they weighed them before and after and worked out how much they were bleeding. So this is one big difference between humans and other primates and other animals, is that they really don't bleed anywhere near as much as we do. It might partly just be a body size thing, so we're much bigger. But it does mean that, therefore, it can be quite difficult to notice menstruating animals in the wild, because there's obviously lots of other mess going on in those situations.
And have we observed animals menstruating in the wild, though, or is it only in captivity that we've seen it?
Yeah, no, definitely. So we do definitely see it in the wild. It's not just something that happens in captive animals. The difference in the wild is that animals are restricted by things like nutrition and stress levels. So if an animal is, starving, then they don't tend to menstruate in the same way. They maybe don't menstruate, or their cycles stop for a while. Partly because the point of menstruation is to sort of build up the womb lining for pregnancy. And if you don't have enough nutrition for yourself, you don't really want to be investing that into a fetus. And also stress levels. So in animals where they have a social system, where there's a hierarchy, often the lower ranked females might not breed, might not have a cycle, whereas the higher ranked females may have a cycle instead. So we do see that kind of change. And this also happens in humans. We just don't see it quite so much these days. But so you tend to see more menstruating in captivity because the animals are well fed.
And could it be, Natalie, that there are other animals that menstruate that we don't know about them yet because we haven't observed it, we haven't seen it?
Definitely, yeah. Like I said, they're not menstruating as much as we are, so not producing so much blood, so it might not be quite so obvious, particularly in the wild. And I think also, traditionally people going out and doing studies on animals in the field, maybe they weren't people that menstruated. So hopefully the more people that menstruate and go out and study things in the wild, the more people might actually be looking out for these kinds of things, and we might find out more that way.
Absolutely. Now, again, excellent questions coming from our audience, and I think it's about time to shoot some at you, Natalie. Let's see if we can figure it out, because as we said, we don't know that much about it. But there's a question from YouTube. They're asking, do animals get pains during periods? Do we know? Is that something that we're studying, for example, with the spiny mouse?
Yeah, so that's something that we're interested in. It's really hard to determine whether an animal is in pain. There's some anecdotal evidence that baboons perhaps get sort of menstrual cramps. Part of the reason we get such bad menstrual cramps in humans is there's quite a lot of material to kind of get rid of. So there probably is some pain, but given that there's not so much material being sort of expelled, it's probably not as bad as for humans.
And a question related to that, Natalie, Annabelle was asking, Does that mean that the spiny mice are in more danger from predators when menstruating? You said before that they're a bit slower, that they eat differently, that they vocalize more. So could they be more in danger of predators while menstruating?
Yeah,
And
no, possibly. No, that's a really good question. Again, I don't think there's been enough research, but I know in that study, the premenstrual syndrome study on those spiny mice, they found that they also moved less. So it might be partly that by moving around less when they're menstruating, they're less likely to encounter predators. But I guess animals in the wild are often bleeding for various reasons. So hopefully the amount of slowing down because of menstruation is hopefully not so bad that it will cause too much increase in predator activity.
And this is a question that it's a little bit bigger, but Becca Stewart is asking: Has there been any research into if animals other than humans get endometriosis that you know of? Have you found anything about that, Natalie, at all?
So I haven't found anything that's natural, but again, I suspect this is something if we were to study more, we might find. And I think again, this is the hope with the spiny mouse that we might be able to find this. So you can induce similar things to endometriosis in normal laboratory mice. We're doing unpleasant things to them, but as far as I know, there hasn't been any research of this in primates, for example.
And I think it just goes to show that there's much more research needed on this, because I think the more we understand the natural world, the more we'll keep understanding how our human bodies work as well. And also, really great question that I was going to ask you at the end of the show, but actually I'll ask to you now. Do all the species that menstruate have menopause? That's a question from Wendy as well.
Oh, again, that's a really good question. No. So we don't think that many of the apes have menopause, for example, whereas things that do have menopause, like the orca or the killer whale, and also other kinds of whales, they don't menstruate. So we're not sure that there's exactly a link there between those two things. But again, menopause is something that is never studied enough and would be really interesting to look into more. And there probably are way more mammals that go through menopause than we're aware of at present.
Again, is something that needs more study, and I think that's what is really exciting about this topic, that we don't know that much, and it's also quite striking about it. Now, Natalie, let's keep talking about menstruation, because it's a question actually that has come from our audience that actually I was going to ask you. So we've been talking about animals that menstruate. You've told us about the macaques, the bonobos, our relatives, the bats as well that do it, the cute spiny mouse. But this question also came from our audience. Anne Sophie was asking, they were wondering about all other animals that bleed, whether they're in the cycles. It comes to mind things like dogs or cats that maybe pet owners might have seen them bleeding. What is going on there? Is that has to do with breeding season, for example, or when we say that an animal is in heat? What is happening there?
Yeah, so most mammals don't menstruate, and instead they have what's called an estrous cycle. And some animals will have a very regular cycle, like the menstrual cycle is. Other animals will only cycle in their breeding season, and that will be when the females will either change their appearance or their smell or their behavior to attract males. So if you've heard the racket the foxes make outside over the winter, that's the female fox screaming to say that they're receptive at the moment to males. And so often there are animals like this. There are other animals that don't have a cycle at all, and actually in order to ovulate they have to mate, and when they mate ovulation is stimulated. So cats and rabbits and ferrets all fall into that group. Dogs are a really weird and interesting one because they do bleed, but it's not a period. So they bleed sort of earlier in the cycle, before the dog is actually receptive. And so that blood actually comes from the vagina. We've not really, as far as I can tell, there's no real understanding of why that happens. So the discharge starts off very bloody and then becomes waterier, and that's when you can tell that the dog is properly receptive to pregnancy. But I've heard, people have to put dog nappies on their dogs because it can be quite an amount if you don't want to wreck your furniture and things like that. But it's not a period, it's just some blood that comes from the vagina. It's not the lining of the womb at all.
Brilliant. Natalie, and now a big question. It has come from our audience as well, but I think it is the big question of this show. And that question is, why do some mammals menstruate and some others don't? Is there an evolutionary advantage or disadvantage? Why did it evolve?
Yeah, so there's been lots and lots of ideas over the years about why this might happen and whether, there's actually an adaptive advantage to having a period. But we think probably the most sensible solution or sensible idea for me at the moment is this idea of the parent offspring conflict hypothesis. So basically you've got the gestational parent and you've got a fetus, and they both have different aims, evolutionarily speaking. So the fetus wants to get as much nutrition as possible from the mother so it can be big and strong when it's born, whereas the mother wants to do that but also wants to keep some nutrition for herself. The parent wants to keep some nutrition for themselves. Also, they would like to have further offspring potentially in the future. So you've got this conflict between the parent and the fetus going on. This is particularly a big problem in mammals like the ones that menstruate. So many of them have what's called a hemochorial placenta. So the placenta is how the fetus gets nutrition from the parent. There's a picture here showing a sort of early stage placenta. And in these mammals that menstruate, it's really like fiercely attached to the parent. It's very invasive. It's directly connected to the parental blood vessels. And so what we think might be going on is that womb lining, that big thick lining that these menstruating species have, is a way of the parent protecting itself from the fetus. So stopping the fetus from burying in too deeply before the placenta has been properly formed and causing problems for the parent. And then if there is no pregnancy, so it's kind of like a pre-gaming, pre-prep for pregnancy, pregnancy doesn't occur, then the lining is useless at that point. It's been changed so much that it can't be reabsorbed. There's too much of it as well. And so the period happens. So the period's not adaptive. It's not been evolved for. It's just a kind of byproduct side effect of this protective layer.
That's brilliant. But so that's the idea that we have of it at the moment, Natalie. But I think the general feeling that I'm getting from this is that we still know very little. There's still so much more to find out about this. Why is that? Why do we know so little?
It's the answer for everything, I guess. Patriarchy. So up until fairly recently, most people who could afford to be researchers were wealthy, straight white men. And so they had a particular way of looking at the world and particular biases, which have made research around menstruation really difficult. On top of that, there's a lot of taboos associated in lots of cultures with menstruation, and a lot of embarrassment about talking about it, which is why I was really excited to do this today and talk about menstruation more. So I think the more people researching this who have periods, the more likely we are to find out more things.
So I suppose if you don't experience something, your view of it in the world is going to be biased in some way. You might not be looking for it. You might not be thinking about it. It's a little bit like when that astronaut went to space and they gave them 1,000 tampons for a week, I think, or something like that. It's because you're not thinking about it, so you're not looking for it as well. And it's not only in nature that we know so little, we also know so little in humans, and I suppose is the same reason. Now, historically, you've mentioned it already, there's been loads of taboos around it, myths around it, and how has period been seen throughout the ages? I think it took us a while to understand it, didn't it?
Yeah, so again, because partly the people writing down histories and writing down science were mostly male, we're missing a lot of information. So as far as we can tell, it's taken a really long time for people to link periods and fertility. And so there's some quite sort of funny stories, but very misogynistic stories. So Pliny the Elder, the Roman writer, he wrote that menstrual blood would actually change dogs and make them mad, and wilt crops and dim mirrors and blunt weapons and kill bees for some reason. There's also Greek texts which suggested that people that menstruate are actually just more spongy, and they need to menstruate to get rid of the extra fluid that they've brought in and stuck in their spongy bodies. But then there's even more kind of recent stuff where we still have this kind of taboo about it being very dirty and wrong. And so even in the 1920s, somebody did some, I'm going to call them experiments, where they proved that menstrual blood was full of these toxins called menotoxins, which they proved would wilt flowers and turn food bad. And I mean, this is meant to be science, but it's also very closely related to sort of cultural ideas about how women shouldn't churn butter when they're menstruating. They shouldn't make jam and mayonnaise, you were telling me about in Spain, as
Yep.
one of the things that you've been told. I was also told you shouldn't get a perm when you're menstruating because it won't hold. So the 80s must have been very difficult for people menstruating. Yeah, so all these really weird ideas about dirt and stuff, and so we're only just really understanding what's going on.
And that is just mind blowing that, we started talking about Pliny the Elder, the Greeks, and then we jump straight to 1920s and how we still didn't understand it then. And we hear these myths that maybe some of us might have heard when we were little about, yeah, not being able to churn butter, make mayonnaise, or even have a bath sometimes because then something will happen to you or something will happen to the thing that you're doing with. And I think it just clear after this chat and after chatting to you, after all the research that you've done, Natalie, that we still need to know so much about it. There's still so much to find out and so much to understand. We are just putting our fingers on what is behind all this and not understanding it. Whereas all the things that happens to our body, we might understand them better. And after all, we'll nearly half of the population, the people that menstruate. So I think there needs to be more. But as you said before, I think that the more people that are able to study these topics and are able to study nature, the more knowledge we'll have about that. Do you think so?
Yeah, completely. I think the more people that menstruate and go out and investigate menstruation, the more we're going to find out about menstruating animals.
That's brilliant. Natalie, sadly, we've reached the end of the show. Now, I will stay talking to you about this for another hour, another day, even, and trying to find out more about it. I think people watching will feel the same. We've got excellent questions coming from our audience, and I hope that we manage to answer as many as possible. But we've reached the end of the show, and I'm going to have to say goodbye to you now. But hopefully see you in the future to talk more about this topic and other topics about nature. Bye, Natalie. And thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I really, really hope that you've enjoyed the show as much as I have. Thank you so much for your excellent questions. They were brilliant, and it was fantastic to chat about them with Natalie. It's been a pleasure for me to talk about this with Natalie and have you watching. So, yeah, thank you so much for watching. One thing that I would like to remind you all before I leave is that the museum is still closed, but we are really striving to keep bringing this kind of content to you, to your homes. But while we're closed, we're losing vital income. So if you're able to give us a donation, we would really, really appreciate it. You can donate if you're watching from YouTube, and the donation button is on top of the chat. And if you're watching from the website, it's on the top right corner. We would really, really appreciate it. But now it's time for me to say goodbye for today. But we have plenty of shows in our storage coming to you every Tuesday. Now, next week, my colleague Khalil Thurlowy will be talking with a museum scientist about DNA in the air. So if you've enjoyed this, do not miss Nature Life next week on Tuesday. But that's all from me. I'm going to say thank you to you once again and see you next time. Bye.